the royal historian Elizabeth, that's a suitable name as well, Norton, joins us this morning.
Morning.
You were convinced it was going to be George all along.
I was, yeah, I did pick George as a likely contender, really.
Why George then? Because it has lots of historical connotations, doesn't it?
It does. I mean, it's obviously the name that the Queen's father chose when he became king as George VI, and actually the first 50 years of the 20th century, it was pretty much always a George on the throne. After Queen Victoria briefly at the beginning of the century, and then Edward VII, apart from a brief few months of Edward VIII, it's just George really, so it's a big Windsor name.
We understand that the Queen was told that he was being named George on her visit yesterday morning, and of course she will be delighted. That was her father's name.
Yeah, I mean, actually it wasn't her father's name. Her father's first name was Albert, but he chose George.
Because they don't have to be king or queen with the name that they're christened with.
No, that's right. There have been a few changes in recent sort of centuries. So there was Albert, who became George VI. Edward VII, his grandfather, was Albert as well. Queen Victoria was actually Alexandrina Victoria.
Oh, so I was going to move on to Alexander. So just tell us a little bit about the history behind that name, because they've really chosen, very carefully, obviously.
They have, yeah. I mean, they're very traditional names. Alexander isn't a particularly popular name in the British royal family, but there are a couple of female Alexandras or Alexandrinas. So there was Queen Alexandra, who was Edward VII's wife at the beginning of the 20th century, and then, of course, there is Alexandrina Victoria, the great Queen Victoria.
So there's all this history going into it. I mean, there's, of course, Louis, the third name, which I assume is a link back to Mountbatten.
Yeah, I would think so. And also, of course, it's one of Prince William's middle names. So, I mean, that's a nice nod to the baby's father, really. But, yeah, also, of course, Louis Mountbatten and the French royal family who the baby is descended from. So, it's got a great history as well.
They've done their homework, haven't they?
They really have, yeah. They're really carefully chosen names.
Tell us about the timing as well, because didn't we have to wait, for Prince Charles, it was a month or something, wasn't it? And quite a lot for William as well.
Yeah. They seem to have really thought it through. I mean, George was really the obvious choice. I mean, I suspect that they'd already had it chosen, and they waited until the Queen visited yesterday to make sure that she was obviously happy with their choices. But it's such a nod back to the past of the dynasty. It's actually a really great choice.
Could they have gone for something that they really want, something wacky that hadn't been in a royal tradition, but that they just really like? Do you think they could possibly have done that, or is that just not an option?
There's always got to be a first of any name. George I in 1714, so it was a new name for a king. I don't think they would have done that. I mean, actually, the Queen went quite unusual with her choices, with Charles and Andrew. Neither of them are very common in the royal family. There's been two King Charleses, but not since 1685, and one of them got his head chopped off. So it's not the most usual name for her to choose.
Well, I was reading some of the precedents for Georges are not great either, are they? I mean, one of them ended up in a barrel of wine or something, and another one was beheaded. I mean, it's any name is going to have connotations.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah, I mean, actually, yeah, the first royal George that I could come up with, and I think he's the first George in the royal family, was the younger brother of Edward IV at the end of the 15th century, who betrayed his brother, was convicted of treason, and possibly drowned in a butt of Malmsey wine at the Tower. So that's the one who was drowned.
Goodness me. There will now, presumably, this is what happens, be lots of new baby Georges, will there, do you think? Will it have that sort of influence or not?
It may do, but I was trying to rack my brains. I'm a similar age to Prince William, and actually I was thinking, I don't think I knew any Williams growing up. So whether it will or not, it's a great name, so it may well do.
OK, thank you very much. Good to speak to you. Thank you.
Thanks for your time.
Historian Elizabeth Norton has written several books on the Boleyn family and knows all about Anne's journey to becoming Queen.
What would it have been like for Anne growing up here?
She would have spent a lot of time with her siblings, her elder sister Mary and her younger brother George. They would have been taught their letters by the parish priest before having tutors employed when they were a bit older.
Education was a big thing here, obviously.
Absolutely. Education was particularly important to the Boleyns. Anne was renowned for being well educated. Particularly she could speak French, she could read and write. And it's really that shapes her. Anne's time in France was crucial to the woman that she later became. She learnt style and grace at the French court. It was the most sophisticated in Europe. She also learnt courtly love. Anne would have learnt how to interact with men while she was in France. So when she came back to England wearing her French hoods, which showed a daring amount of hair, she stood out. Mary was later referred to by Francis of France as a very great whore and infamous above others. It looks as though she was sent home in disgrace before emerging at the English court as a mistress of Henry VIII. Anne saw that her sister was simply discarded by the king with very little to show for it, and she decided that she wanted something else. She wanted a good husband and was not going to yield to the king. Henry wanted Anne to be his mistress, something that Anne, who was looking to make a good marriage, could never allow. We know that Anne retreated back to Hever Castle. Henry VIII's love letters survive and show him pursuing her, so speaking of being struck with the dart of love. Eventually he realised he had to divorce his wife, and that led on to the long period of divorce before they could marry in 1533.
So in your opinion, Elizabeth, what do you think was the biggest influence in Anne's upbringing that shaped her life?
For Anne, it has to be France. When she returned to England at the age of around 21, she was French in all but birth. She was fluent, she had a certain grace about her. And as part of that, her father must have a great deal of the credit, because he was one who believed in her enough to send her first to Brussels and then on to France. And it's really that shapes Anne and sets her apart from all the other women at the English court.
You get a real sense of the place. You still get these sort of small little medieval looking streets. Yeah.
I've asked historian Elizabeth Norton for her learned opinion.
I tend to use the maps that they've used. They're great for sort of big buildings and palaces. You can get a real sense of what was going on there, but not for the ordinary houses. The houses were almost touching often on the streets, and it was dark, it was a maze, it was dirty, it was noisy. There was a grand masque at Greenwich Palace, which is a sort of a ceremonial event, so it would be a dance. Anne was cast as one of the seven ladies playing the seven virtues. Appropriately enough, as it turned out, she played Perseverance. The ladies danced in a mock castle. They then defended it from a group of masked knights. Eventually they came down and danced with the gentlemen, and the king was unmasked to be one of the knights. So that's the first time that we have Anne and Henry definitely in the same room together. It was noticed that a young man was beginning to spend more and more time with her. This was Henry Percy, who was quite a significant figure. He was the heir to the Earl of Northumberland, so far out of Anne's league status-wise. There were rumours of a secret engagement between the couple. This came to the king's ears, and the king ordered Wolsey to break off the match. Percy's father was summoned from the north and spirited him home, where he was married off immediately, and Anne was sent home to Hever Castle in disgrace.
So she comes back to Hever Castle, and then she and the king are in communication, aren't they?
That's right. So there are 17 love letters written by Henry VIII that survive in the Vatican archives. They're fascinating. They show Henry VIII in love. He would often, at the bottom of the letter, have their initials entwined, and he would draw a little heart around them. It all came to a head at her coronation, where her banners and Henry's banners said H and A for Henry and Anne, and the crowd were heard shouting "Ha, ha," pointing out the banners. She was hated. The end began for Anne in January 1536. Catherine of Aragon died, which Henry and Anne celebrated by wearing yellow. On the day of Catherine's funeral, Anne miscarried a son.